Okay, hello everyone. Thank you so much for attending today. What we want to talk about in this video session is cover chapter 10, which is the supply chain management. So let me share my screen with you. So we want to talk about supply chain management. These are some of the things that we're going to cover in this particular chapter with reference to the supply chain management. And as part of this supply chain management, this chapter starts off with back in 2011 in March with the tsunami and earthquake that took out the power plants there in Japan. I happened to have been in the industry at that time, and as a result of that, that was a very, very delicate time within that industry, not only for the people of Japan, but equally important for the nuclear community and how that had changed the way we operated, and not so much the way we operated, but the way we looked at severe events, and we even had to change some of our processes as a result of that. But it really got started off. This is how this chapter got started off. So I did have some personal experience in dealing with that in recovery as the nuclear industry back during that time. But it did really have an impact to their supply chain in that particular time, and this is part of what this whole chapter is about. And in this chapter, we're introducing this thing of supply chain management and how we're looking at the total time of materials to travel through the entire supply chain. In some cases, that can take minutes up to months, depending on the type of supply chain that it is. But this whole purpose of looking at a supply chain is trying to determine how we can reduce that total supply cycle time, which hopefully would reduce inventory, increase our flexibility, reduce our overall cost, and give us better delivery times. And it's a way for companies to look at their internal processes and to determine what are those things that they're doing that they need to continue internally, as well as looking at their relationships with their external customers as well as suppliers to gain even further improvements in this entire process. And it's really about the application of the systems thinking, and provides kind of a basis for processes that really cuts across the very fabric of every one of our organizations. So this thing of supply chain, figure 10.1 on page 223, kind of goes into and describes what a supply chain looks like in this particular example. But a supply chain really is a set of entities and those relationships that accumulate from different standards, different materials, and information that flows both downstream towards the customer and upstream back to our suppliers. So really, when we think about the downstream flow, what we're referring to is how it flows from the suppliers to the customers, where we have these raw materials, and those raw materials are being transformed or manufactured into a tangible product that flows to downstream from our suppliers down to the customers. Now, anything that returns from the customers back to us, whether it be defective units, recyclables, customer payments, whatever it may be, flows back upstream. So that's the difference between the downstream flow and the upstream flow. And again, as we see this figure 10.1 at the bottom of page 223, kind of gives us a graphical representation in relation to that. And then in figure 10.2 on the next page, well, similar to 10.2 on the next page, is when we're looking at everything as being related to the manufacturer, or in this particular case, Z, the vantage point or the entity, where we have the upstream flow, the downstream flow of our physical supplies as it goes through and through the physical distribution to our retailers and eventually to our customers, which is the downstream or forward materials and information flow. Then we have those things that comes back from our retailers and our customers back upstream or back with materials and information flow. And this is very similar to the graphical representation that you see back on page 224. And typically, with respect to the vantage point, or Z, in figure 10.2, and on this graph being the manufacturer, is really referring to the flow of materials from upstream nodes into Z. Generally is referred to the physical supply coming into it, and the flow that flows through Z going downstream to our customers is the physical distribution side. So we have the physical supply side coming into this vantage point of Z, or the manufacturer, in the physical distribution leaving, going down to the customers. And this really talks about the supply chain, gives a graphical representation of this thing called supply chain management, which is really a process or decision making that we look at it and how we integrate three separate functions of purchasing, operations, and logistics. And we see that over on page 226 in this SOAR model, supply chain operations reference. This is what that model looks like. And it's really describing how this process really, from a supply chain operations reference, really how it flows and what it looks like. So you see that over on page 226. And part of this is what is called demand management, which is the flip side of supply management, and it essentially refers to the decisions that are taken to affect the quantities demanded of one or more products, and where the supply chain management tries to match supply to demand. Demand management focuses on creating and maintaining the quantities of one or more products that can serve a supply chain. And that really is part of what the difference between supply chain and demand management really looks like. But this SOAR model goes into the purchasing functions, and it goes into the logistics functions. So let's look at the purchasing functions just for a few moments down at the bottom of page 227. And these purchases and logistic functions really are the integral to the efficiency and effective performance of supply chains. And it's the way in which operations functions within their firms to deliver the products and services to the customers while meeting all the objectives of the organization. Those objectives may be cost, quality, delivery, as well as flexibility when it comes to meeting the ever-changing needs and demands of our customers. The purchasing and the logistics function is really about how we go about moving those goods and services. We have this terminology called purchasing cycle, which is figure 10.3 at the bottom of page 227, and how it goes into what we learned last week about how we take the user requirements and how we put that into our design engineering, making sure we understand what the specifications are, and how we go about buying and making those type of decisions, go through competitive bidding in our negotiation, supplier selection, going into relationship management, then again, the cycle back to the user. So it's a continuously cycle, very similar to a cycle of improvement, but it's a purchasing cycle again on figure 10.3. Some firms do it differently. Some will look at how we go about measuring supply chain performance, and it's going to be important that as you measure supply chain performance, how we go about doing that. But before we talk about that, let's talk about over on page 228, when we think about global sourcing. And that global sourcing really is the practice of procuring needed goods and services without being constrained to a specific geographical region. And certainly in today's global economic environment, with the way we use technology today and how we can get anything delivered anytime from any location directly to our front door. So global sourcing certainly has changed the face when it comes to supply chain management. But there are some, as you can imagine, there are challenges associated with global sourcing. Certainly if it's coming from a foreign country, that the exchange rates, currency exchange rates may be different. Certainly if their import, export type rules and regulations are different, even in the instability of the economics of that particular country, and whether they have the natural resources to which to provide what we need. So in any case, careful evaluations got to take place to ensure that if you're using global sourcing, that particular host country that's providing that or geographic region has the resources as well as the capabilities as well as the stability to ensure that you're going to get what you need when you need it if you're manufacturing a good service or product to meet your customer demands. Part of this logistics functions, when you think about the supply chain management, deals with reverse logistics over on the page 228. And reverse logistics really is discussing the movement, storage, and disposal of goods that are returned by the customer. What do you do with those things that are defective? How does that company recoup some of its cost? They give us this great example here where Dell provides convenient ways to recycle an old computer, and they will even in some cases donate those recycled computers for those organizations who don't have the resources to which to go out and purchase new equipment. But it's a way in which companies look at what customers own and how we can provide that service to a customer so that in essence, we don't fill up our landfills, as I guess is a great example. But reverse logistics over on page 228. Several key decisions that's typically going to have to be considered when you think about logistics, and that's the choice of transportation, how it's going to be packaged, and the materials process of its handling, and the location and management of those storage points. So the transportation choice really is concerned about the mode of transportation. How do we physically get the goods back through this reverse logistics in the least cost possible to the company who's receiving it, but equally important to make it as convenient as we possibly can to the customer. You have this outbound versus inbound transportation where we're looking at the movement of goods from the local firm to its customers and vice versa. When we think about packaging and materials handling over on page 229, it's a way that how do we protect those goods so that they can get to their end destination without any damage to it whatsoever, whether it's through physical damage or whether it's damage because of improper heating, things of that nature. Then the third one on the bottom of page 229 deals with the management of storage points, focusing on how many storage facilities or warehouses that are needed or that you have access to in the supply chain, where are they physically located at to minimize the transportation cost, what's the number and size, and how we're going to go about shipping those goods to and from the customers. And in some cases, it may be a third-party independent type of shipping, or it may be something that the company is doing internally. But in either case, all three of those points needs to be considered when it comes to logistics functions of an organization, because it has a direct bottom line impact to the overall efficiency, effectiveness, and certainly the profit-making capabilities of an organization. But again, the flip side of that, being in a customer service or being in a customer-oriented type of economy today, customer convenience, customer ease, customer flexibility certainly is paramount when it comes to how they get their goods and services. And probably As I think about how that works, certainly some of the larger shipping firms like UPS, FedEx, and even how Amazon goes about doing their logistics, including Walmart associated with that. But certainly you have big home building suppliers like in our area here, Home Depot and Lowe's. So all of that's a piece of that as well. So when we think about measuring supply chain performance, how do we know that we're maximizing the efficiency and effectiveness of our organization? Well, one of the ways in which we do that is through measuring the actual supply chain in its performance. The first method certainly is through delivery. When you think about delivery, that usually has three distinctive measurements of on-time delivery, fill rate, and lead time. So all three of those is looking at ensuring that we're getting to the customer specifically what they ordered, no more, no less, and on the date and or time that we promised that we were going to do that. If you've ever, I know like a lot of us that deal with Amazon and Prime delivery, that's one of their tenets of who they are. And one of the things that they measure, certainly all the way through that supply chain from the time it leaves that distribution point to it receives, till you receive it, how they track it and monitor it, and how they give you access in their database or give you access to tracking those packages to make sure they get to you. And equally important to think about Amazon is their customer service when it comes to when something does not get to where it needs to be at the time promised. Quality, let me back up. The delivery again has those distinct measures of on-time delivery, fill rate, and lead time. We talked about the delivery. Let's talk about the fill rate. The fill rate is the measure as the percentage of the orders being filled completely from inventory, not having to wait on a restocking of my inventory, but have the ability to fill that when the order comes in. Then the third measure is the replenishment lead time, which is the time it takes when the order is taken to when it's delivered for the customer. Some organizations use just-in-time inventory or made-to-order process lead times, but whatever it is, the goal is to, again, get to the customer what they want when promised. The second component of measuring supply chain performance deals with quality, and quality typically looks like two ways of measuring, including the performance of the product or service. Does it conform to the specifications, and does it meet the customer needs? Quality is certainly influenced by the customer, and the measurement of the organization providing that is to ensure that the product or the goods or the services meet the customer needs, does what it says it's going to do, or does as it is designed to do, and that it doesn't break within a short period of time, but has quality and longevity to it. The third one deals with flexibility, and the flexibility really looks at how rapidly can the organization change in the supply chain, and it usually looks at two common measures of volume flexibility and fixed flexibility, where volume flexibility is where it takes time to increase or decrease an output by a fixed amount of time, where mixed flexibility is looking at how long it takes to change the mix of products or services that's going to be delivered. And this is where a one-size-fits-all approach in today's market may not be acceptable, but think about it from the standpoint that the more you can standardize a product, goods, or services, the less of mixed flexibility that you will have to incur, because mixed flexibility, as good as it may sound to the customer, it can be relatively expensive if you have a product that has a lot of add-ons or have customers have the flexibility to change specifically what they want. So that's the good and bad news story when it comes to flexibility. The next one does with time. The time can be measured not only at individual company, but also across the entire supply chain. And the total supply chain throughput time is the sum of the throughput times, maybe referred to as sometimes the cycle times, but it's really looking at how much time it takes through the total supply chain. Cash to cash cycle times equals the days in inventory plus days in accounts receivable minus days in accounts payable. So even when it comes to cash, we're looking at how we can quickly measure how quickly a customer pays back their bills. So that is certainly a worthy measure. That's another one of those worthy measures to look at that can be used to measure the overall supply chain performance. And over on page 232, where we look at the next piece associated with this is cost. But before I jump to cost, let me make this statement about cash to cash. If you can decrease that cycle time, then you certainly can improve your firm's profitability. Because if you're decreasing that cycle time and you're focusing your efforts there to decrease that, what that's an indication of is that your customers are paying their bills on a timely fashion. And because they're paying on a timely fashion, that's direct accounts receivable that's coming back into the organization. So let's talk about cost. Cost over on page 232. Cost really deals with the unit cost of the product or service, and it's really defined by the total manufacturing cost, which may include materials, labor, overhead, and that's divided by the number of units produced. It may also include the distribution cost, the logistic cost, the storage cost, the insurance cost, the inventory carrying cost. Even taxes could be considered as part of that as well. So cost is a measure that can be analyzed in the supply chain as well. It is one of those measures that really looks at from the time it comes in the front door to the time it gets to the customer. What's that total cost? That's an important measure as well. So that was the three big measures, certainly not the only ones, but the typically three big measures when you talk about measuring supply chain performance. So let's go over into page 232, 233 as we talk about the bullwhip effect. And this bullwhip effect really describes the variability that in its orders that received by its entities upstream in supply chain, which in turn affects the amount of inventory that those entities hold. So it's really about how effective is that organization as they take the goods and services and they make those goods and services into a tangible product, and how the variabilities in those orders are being established so that that organization can maintain its competitive advantage. So that's what the bullwhip effect is over on page 232. And 233 kind of gives you an example of a bullwhip effect when it comes from the different three tiers of order process in the inventory levels. And this figure 10.4 really illustrates that the supply chain is a highly interactive process. It's bullwhip accelerator. It's really looking at how often is supply chain being observed to determine what are those points that need to be improved. Where are as we studied about, even with perfect information available, the bullwhip effect still can be observed in the supply chain. The best way to improve that supply chain certainly is to reduce the total replenishment time frame, but that's got to be balanced with the overall inventory, the inventory carrying cost, the inventory cost, storage, and everything of that nature. So it's a balance of looking at how this bullwhip effect is going to impact your organization. And over on page 235, two strategies that has the potential to cause amplification in the supply chain is called safe harbor and inventory panic. And what you want to do is to minimize those human strategies and have a process that's robust, that is providing what you need when you need it at the least cost possible, which is a pass-through cost, or excuse me, a cost that you want to maintain so that your customers are getting a high quality product at the least cost possible. Now, supply chain structural improvements, starting over on page 235, it really looks at how those products and services are being offered, the types and locations of the facilities, the processes that are being utilized, what's the layout from a forward and vertical integration, and how we're making those changes in the process as it relates to the roles and responsibilities, even up to the employees, the suppliers, the systems, the information systems, the production and inventory and control and quality control systems. All of that is being configured or considered when you think about improving the supply chain performance. This supply chain structural improvements begins over on page 236. We'll go into looking at different ways and ways to do that. And this is a few of those ways, looking at forward and backward integration, purchase or pursuing major process simplification, changing the configuration of factories, warehouses, or retail locations, pursuing major product designs, and also up to and working with third-party logistics providers to help us improve our processes. So this forward integration and backward integration typically refers to the supply chain and how, for example, a manufacturer decides to buy a wholesale firm and where it can distribute its own products, and also looking at how they can improve, again, their ability to meet the ever-changing needs of the customer. So you have that piece. We have the offshoring and outsourcing over on page 237. When you're thinking about that, offshoring typically occurs when a firm moves work performed internally to another facility belonging to a firm but in another country, whereas outsourcing typically occurs when the work that traditionally has been performed internally is delegated to another firm. Some advantages and disadvantages, as most organizations will outsource, go offshoring to another country more than not, could be because of direct labor costs, because their labor costs would be cheaper. Could also be because they may have some raw material or some unique manufacturing process that is cheaper for them to do it than it is to ship it to the host country, where outsourcing may be a non-critical activity that that firm has that it wishes to outsource. Again, they may go to a third-party firm because labor is cheaper. They don't have to worry about the training of the employees or maintaining that function. And it probably is a non-critical function that is not going to hurt from proprietary or sensitive information, but maybe, I know in my organization I came out of, one of the things that we went to when I first started, we had almost 24 human resource people at my plant when I started in the early 80s. By the time I left, it was down to 2. And that was a direct result of embracing and utilization of technology. We didn't outsource per se to another firm those functions, but we outsourced in concept where we drove a lot of those functions to be available to online 24 hours a day, 7 days a week through our intranet, where the employees could get a direct, do a little research and find their answers. And they had the opportunity again to call our help desk to get some additional insights if needed. But it greatly improved access to some of that human resource information by providing them online. So it was kind of like outsourcing, but almost like an internal outsourcing by the utilization of technology. And part of this offshoring production is looking at really the entire cost of that ownership. And again, how can we ensure that those organizations or your organization or even my organization can do that in order to maintain its long-term profitability. And because we were using technology and using supply chain management, certainly through the growth of e-commerce, through those business to business and business to customers, and how we're doing that to ensure, again, that we can maintain our overall competitive advantage as an organization. Before I jump here, look at figure 10.2 at the bottom of page 237, and it goes into a little bit more explanation as this total cost of ownership for outsourcing. Over on page 238, we talk about part of this, looking at this offshoring and this postponement strategy that Hewlett-Packard implemented, which is an interesting concept. And over on page 10.5, page 239, figure 10.5, when they talk about component swapping modality and third-party logistic providers, all of those were just a strategy that Hewlett-Packard utilized so that they could improve their product offering to their customers. In this technology and supply chain management is over on page 242. But before we jump there, part of page 240, when you think about supply chain infrastructure improvements, you're looking at ways in which a company can improve that through cross-functional team partnerships, setup time reduction, information systems, and even cross-docking, and some of those concepts that could be used to improve the supply chain. The supply chain, you have to be working with your external vendors who supplying you those products or those services that you need to ensure successful. So again, so that your business can be successful. Over on page 242, they give the example there of cross-docking, which is a concept that Walmart really created. And the basic idea that they had is that a supplier's shipments are taken from various docks at the warehouse, where they are arrived and transferred directly to a Walmart truck or another dock. So they're constantly doing that just to minimize their time being spent in inventory. It's really about the economies of scales and how they were able to do that to be successful as an organization. Now, over on page 242, 243, we get into this concept of technology and supply chain management. Again, we gave the example earlier about how technology and the internet certainly has changed. E-commerce certainly has changed the way we look at businesses today, and they kind of describe that here in this business to business and business to consumer concepts, with the utilization of technology and how technology is so vitally important in today's global economy. Bottom of page 243, we go into this concept called e-procurement, which is also how we go about using technology or leveraging technology to our advantage to ensure that our part order replacement and order fulfillment, how it interacts electronically through our business-to-business connections, where it automatically feeds into our reordering process to get that supply chain management concepts going, to ensure that those just-in-time inventories are being met, and all those bar codes, scanning codes that you see in a lot of stores are directly linked back to their logistics. So not only are they looking at what are the consumers' buying behaviors and what they need to stock when they need to stock based on seasons, based on geographic regions, based on individual consumer taste, but equally important, how all that scanning goes into their procurement as well as their supply chain management, where it minimizes human interface. So all of that is part of this technology and supply chain management, so that, again, minimizes human interface. The process becomes automated, as we see here in this figure 10.6, to ensure that that process continues all the way through request to our buy-in to our replenishment, supplying all the way through our repayment type process. Types of some of the e-procurement activities here that you see could occur on online catalogs, third-party auctions, or private exchange. So that's just a few, certainly not all inclusive. What are some of the problems with e-procurement? Technology, we're dependent upon it, and when technology breaks, what do? What's our backup systems associated with that? Even certainly in today's environment, we're certainly concerned with data breaches. And like you've seen, there was a recent data breach at one of our credit reporting agencies here in this country, where over 140 million consumers, their private information. So e-procurement, certainly for those business organizations, and the potential of cyber attacks is one of those. What are the joint value propositions that's going to benefit the consumer, the supplier, the manufacturer, and certainly accuracy and database issues. And again, when electronics don't work or when the database crashes, what's your backup plan? Some of the supply chain risk, some more of the supply chain risk and resilience over on page 245 deals with, obviously, because we're using e-procurement, using technology, and we're in this global economy now, these supply chains really spans across multiple countries, numerous suppliers and customers. The complexity certainly has increased, which subjects itself to a higher risk, as we see some of those risks here of unexpected distributions in supply and demand, whether it's natural or man-made. Certainly gives us some potential to disruptions and higher risk. And we define supply chain resilience as the ability to quickly respond to unexpected disruptions in supply chain or demand that can either be, again, natural or man-made disasters. One of the risk mitigation strategies that they indicate here, and that you will also see over on page 246 and 247 in figure 10.7 and 10.3, deals with the various stages of resiliency. What's going to be the proactive plan? How do we go about minimizing those damage? And what's going to be our post-recovery, where you see that over it again, figure 10.7 and 10.3, but goes into more detail with reference to this particular topic. So this concludes chapter 10. Thank you for watching today.